welcome to this brand new series that we are launching for you called the Simplified, where in each episode we are going to pick up one topic, one big news development and break it down for you, really explain to you with the help of experts and not just me talking, but really explain to you various aspects, help you understand the overall issue. To begin with, today we're going to be talking about what is happening in our neighboring country of Sri Lanka, which is literally going through one of the worst economic crises that it has ever seen in its history. In fact, that economic crisis has now converted into a full-blown national emergency, leading to political turmoil and really hardships for everybody in that country. So we are going to talk about what is happening in Sri Lanka today, and I'm going to break it down into very basics for us to understand. Firstly, of course, what's really going on, what has led to this worst economic crisis for Sri Lanka, what is it that the government has done so far, and what of its policies may have backfired for the country itself, leading to the current situation that we are staring at. Did COVID have a role to play? Did the pandemic, like across the world, have a role to play? Or is there more to the crisis that we are looking at in Sri Lanka? We're also going to talk about the way forward for the country and the key takeaways from the way the government has handled the situation so far in Sri Lanka. And to help us understand this, we have someone, an expert, joining us live from Colombo on this conversation, Dr. Saravanamutthu. Thank you so much for speaking to us. He's the Executive Director for Center for Policy Alternatives, joining us right now, an institution, an NGO that's been speaking quite a bit about what's going on, the solutions one should be looking at, and things that have actually gone wrong. So, Dr. Saravanamutthu, I just want to start off by asking you, if you had to explain to us, we're reading news about shortage of food, shortage of fuel, medicines, staples, power cuts extending up to 10 hours, long queues for every other essential. We've now read about massive protests and violence that has unfolded on the streets, en masse resignations by the entire cabinet of ministers that has taken place, essentially an economic turmoil which is also now converting into a political crisis. How would you describe what is happening on ground today?
Sri Lanka is facing the most unprecedented crisis that it has ever had since independence. There is a total devastation in terms of the economy, in terms of all of the shortages, the foreign exchange crisis, all of that. Now, the people have come out, and it is not organized by a political party, but people have come out in small pocket demonstrations, larger demonstrations, calling for President Gotabaya Rajapaksa and his family, who are in control of something like 70% of the economy, to go. They have had enough of the lack of capacity, the greed, the wastage, the plunder that has been visited upon this country by the Rajapaksa family. So the issue at the present moment is as to whether the president will resign, or, as he said, he has called for all parties to join him in an interim government. He's also said that he will negotiate a restructuring of debt with the IMF and appoint a technical committee to do those negotiations. But I think the public sentiment is especially strong, and it won't stop short of seeing the Rajapaksas out of office. Their greed, their inefficiency, their lack of capacity has compounded this crisis to this particular position.
The Rajapaksa family, of course, has been around and has largely controlled the entire politics and the governance in Sri Lanka for a long time now. But let's try and understand what are the various factors that has led to this crisis. Since 2012, for our viewers to understand, the economy has been in a downward spiral as far as Sri Lanka is concerned. They had a series of problems much before the pandemic also hit, and we will talk about how the pandemic actually made it all worse. But the fact that Sri Lanka is currently staring at two sets of problems. One, they have run out of money to the extent that they're not able to even pay for the basic essentials. So they need that money. The country needs that money to even keep the country going at the bare minimum level. Two, then they need even more money to repay the rising debt, the debt that they have borrowed from IMF, from various global institutions, from different countries, including China. That is the debt that they need to repay at some point. So they need money right now for immediate purpose, and then of course to repay that debt. But how did we reach this point where we're staring at a two-fold problem?
We have reached this point because all our governments have treated the people of this country as voters, and therefore have pandered to providing jobs in the public service jobs, extra salaries, all of that, none of which we could afford. Then we come to the situation of the Rajapaksas, where they seek Chinese support, both in terms of diplomatic protection against war crimes and all of that, and also in terms of vanity projects, harbors, ports, all of that. So we have spent far, far more than we can afford. And as a consequence, we are now in this debt where we have borrowed in the international markets as well, in terms of international sovereign bonds, which are coming in for payments. We have to pay something like $7 billion for the next couple of years every year, and we just don't have that money. COVID and the war in the Ukraine has obviously affected our situation, but it has not caused it. It has been compounded by that fact, and that in 2019, when President Gotabaya Rajapaksa came into office, he reduced the tax base with a loss to the exchequer of about $500 billion. In addition to that, he decided, and I think it was foreign exchange that it was his particular concern, to turn the entire agricultural sector away from chemical fertilizer to organic fertilizer almost overnight. That has created severe disruption as far as the food supply is concerned. And on top of all of this, he and his government have insisted that the payments with regard to the international sovereign bonds must be made. And as a consequence, we don't have foreign exchange to get our basic necessities for our people. And therefore, we've got the situation where you have tremendous queues and shortages for everything. So it's the mismanagement, the callous disregard of the government that has allowed things to come to this particular situation.
So, like you pointed out, one of the key factors has been the mismanagement, and in fact, some of the government decisions in the last few years that instead of fixing the problem has only worsened the problem, be it the ban on fertilizers and chemicals via which the government was actually trying to save some forex, but it ended up hitting the food output of the country so badly that in times of a pandemic, when rest of the world actually depended on its growing farming sector, Sri Lanka couldn't do that, and they ran short on food, and then they had to consequently import food. The other one that our expert was also talking about was the cut in taxes. So the government decided to cut income tax, the government decided to cut value added tax, which meant that the government didn't earn enough money. And at a time when the government had to spend a lot more money during the pandemic, they didn't have enough revenues coming in. That compounded the problem more. And so they printed more and more money to try and fix that problem, to get a control on that situation, which led to inflation of almost 25% for food and 17% overall. Those are the numbers we are looking at. You mentioned the IMF, and there is much debate, Dr. Saravanamutthu, about how the government's agreements with IMF have been. Some blame it on the IMF, saying that the tough conditions that IMF imposed worsened the situation for Sri Lanka. Others say that now the government isn't moving fast enough to get into an agreement for further extension of credit, to get another loan and help the people. How do you see this debate?
Well, I see no alternative but going to the IMF. The conditionalities of the IMF may well be tough, but Sri Lanka has to engage in fundamental economic structural reform. And that's bitter medicine. So the situation will probably get worse before it gets better. We have no alternative but to go to the IMF, because the IMF operates as a kind of international sanitary inspector. If it gives us okay, we can get more bilateral finance, more multilateral finance. We can enter the markets again. Our rating is so poor that we don't have access to the money available in the international financial markets. So I don't think we have much choice. We should have gone to the IMF 9 months ago or even a year ago. If you look at countries that have gone to the IMF, they have come out of the situation within a period of 6 to 9 months.
Okay, so then let's talk from here on what are the options. One, you say that the general sentiment within the people is that this government and the Rajapaksa family and the brothers must go. That's as far as the political setup is concerned. How does Sri Lanka get out of the economic crisis it's facing?
Well, the economic crisis will be with regard to an agreement with the IMF on debt restructuring. We can't keep paying back these sovereign loans, sovereign bonds. We have to get into a proper negotiated settlement with our creditors where we will defer payments and use that foreign exchange to provide for basic essentials and get out of that situation maybe in 6 to 8 to 9 months. That is the only alternative that we have, and accept the IMF conditionalities with regard to the exchange rate, which will then eventually come down to a plateau and stabilize. We have to consider getting rid of tremendously loss-making state-owned enterprises, and also indeed cutting the public sector. But without disproportionate responsibility and burden for the poorest of the population.
Okay, what about the country's own economy and reviving the growth there? Now, obviously, that's a problem that the rest of the world is also struggling with at different levels. But for Sri Lanka, it's worse. You're staring at a situation where you're not exporting enough, you're importing a lot more, you're not producing enough at home. The tourism sector has been badly hit because of the pandemic. Now, while you look at, restructuring your debt and bringing in more money or borrowing more money from IMF and elsewhere, what about fixing problems back home?
No, absolutely. I mean, there is a crisis of governance. We have an executive presidency, an all-powerful executive presidency, but within that presidency, there is no economic capacity or governance capacity. So we need to change that. We need to get a hold of the situation in terms of all of those conditions that I outlined to you with regard to the IMF. We also probably need to get rid of the executive presidency, bring everything back to Parliament with proper checks and balances on how the executive operates. That will be able to get rid of corruption, get rid of inefficiency, and we need to come up with, therefore, a proper, comprehensive plan of where Sri Lanka is going in the next 10 years.
Thank you so much, Dr. Saravanamutthu, for joining us with your insights and helping us understand what's going on and what possibly are the alternatives for Sri Lanka. That being said, of course, it's not going to be an easy road. Perhaps, possibly, things will get worse in the near term than before they begin to get better. We are staring at a situation right now where the entire cabinet has resigned, but not the Prime Minister. The President continues. The Governor of the Central Bank of Sri Lanka has resigned. There was a curfew, but people defied that curfew, came out on the streets, and they have no other option. They are now tired and frustrated of waiting in queues for basic supplies of medicines, of food, of milk. They're running out of baby powder. They ran out of paper, so students couldn't take their exams in Sri Lanka. There's been a massive shutdown and a clampdown on social media, so information is difficult to come by. And if this is a response that we continue to see by those who are in power, situation would only get worse before it gets better. Meanwhile, everybody hopes and expects that the country is able to come to an agreement with IMF sooner than later on getting some more money, restructuring their debt. Like our expert pointed out, they are looking at servicing billions of dollars of debt just this year. And Sri Lanka doesn't have the money. They have run out of dollars. They need money to sustain and then money to repay their loans. That was our first attempt here at the Simplified to pick up a complex issue and try and really break it down for me to understand and for you to understand. We're going to be doing a lot more of these conversations here on Simplified. If you have specific topics that you would like us to pick up, then do write into us, do comment on our social media handles. We will take into that account and bring you more and more of such enlightening conversations. Thank you so much for joining me.